Hi guys, we're going to continue today with our study of Freud. Last time we were looking at the three essays on the theory of sexuality, and now we're going to move on to the Civilization and its Discontents, one of the last books that Freud published. Um, so when we were looking at the three essays, we were looking at our sexual development. And so on the one hand, there was a personal side to that. That was the core of it, right? Your body was going through various kinds of physiological changes, and those are correlated with psychological issues that the developing child is dealing with. So on the personal side, you got all this stuff happening. But then that is crucially connected with an interpersonal issue, namely your dealings with your family. So what we saw is that the crucial stages in the formation of personality, the formation of who you are as a person, take the form of the intersection of these personal dimensions with these family relationships. And the issue is basically whether your parents are handling your needs as a very young child, whether they're handling your needs in a healthy way or not. And those needs are primarily this issue of grappling with this profound dependency you have in the oral stage, grappling with the need for developing independence in the anal stage, and then grappling with issues of basically self-interpretation, sexual self-interpretation, in the phallic stage as you deal with these issues of how you're going to identify with sexual and gender role and so on. And so those things, if they're handled well, lay the foundation for a healthy personality and a robust psychological and sexual life and so on. On the other hand, if the way you get through those stages in the context of dealing with your family is not handled so well, then you develop various kinds of problems that get carried forward in your later psychological life, and they're manifested in your sexual life and so on. So that was the main sort of point that was being made there. And that should serve as a reminder, by the way, of what Aristotle said in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 1, when he was talking about sort of our basic development of character, that how you are brought up makes all the difference in what your situation is going to be as an adult. Right? And that's basically the same point that Freud is making here, but he's focusing on those very young years where you're dealing with, where the core of your foundation as a person, the core of your character is intimately interwoven with how you're dealing with these basic developmental issues in a sort of physiological and sexual domain. So that was the core thing we took away from that. So you can already see, what's a person going to be? Well, one thing is you're sort of growing up on the basis of what you bring to the table as a person, what everybody brings to the table as a person, your set of physiological and psychological developmental needs and so on. But you don't do it just by yourself. You do it with your family. And so your ability to carry out your personal thing is crucially shaped by how the interpersonal world of the family intersects with that. And your personal development can't be separated from your navigating of the interpersonal significance, the interpersonal dimensions of family life. Okay, so that's the first way in which your development depends on something outside yourself, right? But now this book is going to look at another dimension. It's also the case, not only do you grow up in a family, it's also the case that you grow up in a society. And so what Freud wants to look at here is the way that the distinctive nature and the distinctive demands of social life, cultural life, that the life in the larger society play a very significant role in that process of personal, psychological, or psychosexual development. And he particularly wants to look again at how that dimension of our experience has the possibility of introducing something quite unhealthy into our development, with the consequence that we grow up unhappy and with problems. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay, but so in order to talk about that, we need to say, well, what is this thing we're talking about? What is society? What is civilization? Right? Anyway, that's the title of the book, Civilization and Its Discontents. So his book is basically about, roughly what civilization is and why that characteristically produces unhappy people. Those are the discontents. But anyway, so what is civilization? Well, let's start with a little definition he gives of that. It's on page 67 of the edition we're using. He says, the word civilization designates the whole sum of the achievements and institutions in which our life differs from that of our animal ancestors, and which serve two purposes: protecting people from nature and regulating people's relations with one another. So, it's not like he has some special magical theory about what civilization is. He's just trying to say, like, what do we mean by this? And that's his attempt, and a pretty normal attempt, to capture what we basically mean when we talk about civilization. As he says, it's basically all those things that differentiate us from the rest of the animal world, all those achievements and institutions that we have that nothing else in nature has. And he says, if you think about what those things are, they're primarily about two things. They're primarily about protecting us from the challenges of nature and about regulating our relationships with each other. And we're going to go on to talk about those things. But before he jumps right into that, he goes into some detail about all the things that go into civilization. And this material is quite good, and you should read through it and use it as an opportunity to think about just what human life is, right? The distinctive world of civilization, of human culture is. And he identifies a series of different things. So he says, this is all between pages 68 and 72. This is in the third chapter of the book. So first he says, we have all these, like basically technology, all these instruments and tools that we develop to make it basically safer and easier for us to deal with nature. Like normally, like if you just think of a little newborn baby, you got a tiny, weak body, and then there's this huge thing of nature with lightning and rainstorms and cold weather and wild animals. And, you think about what nature is if you just had to encounter it raw. As a little baby, you wouldn't have a chance. But even as a grown-up person, if you were just really facing nature purely and simply by yourself, you'd have a pretty tough time. Nature is pretty difficult. My son is very into dinosaurs right now. He's almost 5. But we talk a lot about Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus and so on. And lately we've been watching a few little things on TV about that. And, it's tough life for the Triceratops. It's a plant-eating dinosaur, an herbivore. And it's got to go around getting these plants. And every now and then Tyrannosaurus has come and try to eat it. And it wants to get some sleep. But when it sleeps, it sleeps in the woods. And while it's sleeping, it's a target. And so anyway, my point there is if you just think about that kind of thing, or think of the contemporary life of a gazelle or something like that in the context of lions and so on, like you're just unprotected in this pretty tough environment. And life in the state of nature, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes said in the 1600s, is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. In nature's a tough place to live if you have to do it all by yourself. You're kind of on your own. It's rough, savage, and you're probably going to die. So I want to say that just to conjure up, like nature is great. We like to go out camping and stuff like that. So there are many, many obviously wonderful things to say about nature and to notice about nature. But I'd like you to strip away that comfortable view of nature that you can have because you do live in civilization. Think about what it would be like to live in nature really without civilization. If you were just a raw body, a raw human body facing the wild. And, Triceratops did okay against the Tyrannosaurus. You wouldn't have much of a chance, though. Right? So I'd like you to think about that, about how tough nature is. So that's the first thing Freud says about what civilization is. It's our development of all the arts, all the technology that basically allows us to take our very weak body and kind of make it stronger, and take the very tough nature and make it less threatening. You know, so our technology has allowed us. You know, we sometimes use this kind of language, sort of to tame nature, to make it inhabitable for us. Right? And he says, actually, in describing technology, I'm going to just emphasize that a little bit because I think it's quite some powerful and insightful things that he says here about technology. He says, to a large degree, what you're doing with technology is sort of perfecting or improving human organs. And so if you look at the different kinds of tools that we make, it's like they take functions we already have and magnify them and make them much more powerful. Like you can see, but a telescope lets you see, you know, basically farther and bigger, you know, or a microscope lets you look into smaller things and see them bigger, you know. So those things are taking what you already have and improving it. Or, you know, you can already hit things, but you get a hammer and it allows you to hit much more forcefully and so on. So you could think about that, about tools as taking our organs and magnifying their strength, essentially giving us kind of new organs. And so he says, you know, in that way, technology is almost like a set of prostheses, right? Artificial limbs that we sort of add to ourselves. And so that's a powerful idea. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing we do in civilization is, as he says about us, it's almost like we've made ourselves into something like a prosthetic god. We've made ourselves super powerful by these prostheses, by our technology. But he says that's not the only thing that civilization does. He says another big thing that we're concerned about is beauty. Part of what civilization is this arena in which we try to make things more beautiful. We paint pretty pictures, we make pretty buildings, we wear pretty clothes, and in general, you know, we try to make things more beautiful and give ourselves more experiences of that kind of wonderful thing. And you might just be reminded there of Diotima talking about the power and importance of beauty for us in our lives. She talked about beauty as kind of the presence of here, the presence of the divine in the human world. And so in a way, maybe that's what we're doing when we try to make more and more beautiful things. We're trying to make our world almost like a more divine place, more heavenly or something. Just a thought. Anyway, there's beauty. Well, he says another thing is part of what civilization is the gradual cultivation of cleanliness and order. Right? We want beauty, which is a particular thing. Order and cleanliness aren't quite the same. They're related, but they're a little bit different. Like they're more just a matter of introducing neatness and uniformity and regularity into our relations with things. You know, you can think about that. That's incidentally one of the things where he says, no doubt in lots of ways that's an important part of civilization, and we think of that as an improvement in our lives. But he says that's also one of the things that people can get kind of excessive about, and he talks about that, what he calls the anal character there. So you might look at that and see its relationship back to the anal stage. But anyway, but he says beyond that. So first there's these useful things, the technology. Beyond that, there's beauty, cleanliness, and order. But then he says there's another thing too, which is the cultivation of our higher mental life. And so, this isn't just about individuals, but it's about humanity, right? The development of religions, and especially of things like philosophy and sciences, are the ways we cultivate our grasp of the ultimate nature of things and the deepest truth about things. And that's part of what civilization has done too. Again, you might remember Diotima talking about the sort of higher stages of human fulfillment on her ladder of love and so on. And then he says one last one, though, in addition to all that, the useful arts, technology, beauty, cleanliness, and order, religion, and philosophy, the understanding of the highest things, the ultimate truth. He says the other thing we have is law, and law, which is about justice. Law is regulating the relations between people to make sure that people aren't behaving to others in a sort of unfair, inappropriate way and so on, unjust way. That's his quick but quite insightful and informative study of what civilization is, wrapped up in about 4 pages. So you should go through that to think about that. But so that's what civilization is. And remember, this was an answer to that sort of question like, why are we doing this? Well, we're trying to improve our relationship to the difficult natural world, right? So let's go back to the very beginning of chapter 3 where he says what introduces that. And he says, on the top of 64, he said, he talks about three sources from which our suffering comes. Why are people, why can people be unhappy? He says there are three sources from which our suffering comes: the superior power of nature and the frailty of our own bodies. Well, that's exactly the things we just said. So we can suffer from this difficult situation in nature, and all these things about civilization can help us out with that suffering. But then he says a third one is one of the sources of our suffering. He says, the third source of our suffering, the inadequacy of the regulations governing the relations of humans to one another in family, state, and society. Well, that's interesting. One of the things we can actually suffer from is the very thing civilization gives us, namely the regulations of human relationships. So we've talked about, with Freud, we've talked about what civilization is, why we have it, and we've gone through its basic characteristics. But now we get to the real point of this chapter. What Freud wants to talk about is the way that civilization, that distinctive human reality, the way we're different from the rest of nature, it's a thing that's in a way supposed to be making us happy. It's supposed to be improving our life in relationship to these things that would make it difficult for us to live. But in fact, it is itself one of the things that can cause us suffering. So that's now the thing to talk about. So first of all, the thing he mentioned there was suffering from the regulations about our relations with other people, which is basically the domain of law. We'll get to that in a minute. That's the real core of this. But before that, I want to talk about a separate issue. The first thing he said about civilization is, well, we have technology to improve our relations with nature. Isn't that an unqualified good or an unqualified improvement? Well, he says no. In fact, it isn't. If we look at the world of technology, it's a thing we've introduced precisely to make wild, threatening nature less difficult. So it's supposed to make us happier. But does technology make us happier? Well, he says technology is quite ambivalent in that respect. So first of all, he says, this is on 65 to 66. He says, like, one of the reasons we think, oh, isn't technology great, is you think, oh, look, I got a telephone now. I can talk to my son or daughter when they're away in college in Spain or wherever they are, right? And he says, on the one hand, we look at technology and we think it's so great because of the way it has improved our ability to do various things that were otherwise difficult for us. But then he says, okay, but why was your son or daughter away for college in Spain in the first place? Well, that was technology that made that possible, right? The telephone allows you to connect with your loved ones who are far away only because technology first produced the means for your loved ones to go far away from you. So he said, if there were no railways, no trains or no ocean liners, your son or your daughter wouldn't be in Spain, and you wouldn't have to call them. So he says, one of the interesting things about technology is that quite often the problems that it's fixing are the problems it caused. And technology in that way is always sort of ambivalent. Like even the phone, you think, oh, the phone's going to allow me to be in touch with people. And you think, oh, not just people in Spain, where if you're in Canada, but you have to send a message to somebody who's at the grocery store or something. You can get in touch with them right away and so on. Initially, it looks like a supplement that's going to improve the relationships you already have with people by fixing this one little problem. But what happens with a phone? Soon, the only way you communicate with people is by the phone or by texting or people don't even, in my experience, people hardly ever use the phone for literal phone reasons anymore, right? Sending a voice over distance. It happens, of course, but that's not the primary function. And, people spend a lot of time texting and doing various other things like that. And so formerly, in our story, formerly you talked with your friends a lot, but sometimes when you were apart from them, you wanted to send them a message. Soon, you're only communicating with people by messages and you don't actually spend that much time together. And in fact, maybe when you are together, you actually have a little bit less to say because that structure of sort of small talk by which you used to kind of reintroduce yourself to someone and cultivate a communication and a nice interaction is suddenly gone because you did all the small talk over text. And so suddenly two people get together and like, okay, what are we going to talk about now? What are we going to do now? And you've already said all the things. And in fact, what you might do when you're with your friend is say, oh, excuse me for a minute, I got to write something, and send a text message to somebody else, right? So what I'm getting at there is the way, if you think about the phone in particular, like whether it's calling your son or daughter in Spain, or whether it's texting your friend at the grocery store or whatever, this thing that was supposed to be supplementing a life and making it better, in fact, starts to redefine the very terms under which you live, and often in sort of more alienating and unpleasant ones. Right? So that's just a quick remark about technology and its sort of ambivalence that Freud is bringing out. He says, in fact, man has made himself a prosthetic god. I referred to that before. But he also says, one of the things is these organs, like he's emphasizing the prosthesis idea. And he says on page 69, these organs have not become part of him and give him trouble at sometimes. Right? So this thing that was supposed to be just empowering us and making life better can itself be one of the forces we have to work against. So going back to that first quotation about the three sources of suffering, the third one was civilization itself, the very thing that was supposed to be helping us from the first two sources of suffering. He, at that point, emphasized the law side of civilization, which is what we're going to go on to. The point I'm trying to make here, and the point he's making through his chapter, is that it's actually civilization more broadly. It's not just the law function. Even that simple technological side can cause us as much grief as it can relieve suffering. But now let's get to his real point. So let's read this and think about what the essence of law is. At the bottom of 71, he says we're going to examine how the relations of humans to each other are regulated. That's the basic idea. And he says that's when civilization really starts, when you regulate how people are allowed to behave towards each other. And he gives more or less a definition of this on 72. He says, human life in communities is only possible when a majority gathers that is stronger than each individual and holds together against each individual. The power of this community now establishes itself as law, as opposed to the power of the individual. And then here's so societies are a community, a collective of people deciding they're going to regulate their own behavior and say you can't just do whatever you want, right? And so then he gives this important sentence. He says, this replacement of the power of the individual by the power of the community is the decisive step towards civilization. The essence of this step is that the members of the community restrict themselves in their possibilities of gratification, whereas the individual knew no such limitations. Thus the first demand of civilization is justice, etc. I want you just to think about that idea that society isn't just people coming together. It's not just the fact of proximity. It's people coming together and changing the way they live. It's people coming together and saying, I am going to live as part of this group. I'm going to become a member, basically. So it's coming together and joining. It's not just being in proximity. It's living as a group. And that involves change. It involves you saying, how things seem to me is now no longer the only thing that dictates, how I'm going to behave and how I'm going to live. I have to be concerned about how things seem to us. And so people set up rules for how we're going to behave. And being part of a community means you accepting to live by those rules rather than just doing whatever you want. Again, I mentioned Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics before. I want to mention Aristotle again and refer back to the very first thing we read, which was just a very short selection from the beginning of Aristotle's Politics. When we looked at that, we were just trying to focus on the different ways that we encounter other people in our lives. We talked about the family, we talked about political life and so on. And I just want to come back to that now and emphasize a thing Aristotle said there that we didn't really take up at the time. And Aristotle says there that the polis, which is his Greek word for from which we get the word political. That's his word for what we would now call a city-state. But he says the polis, the city-state, comes into being when people participate together in a kind of collective decision-making for the good of the community, rather than making decisions based on their self-interest or the interest of their families, and instead ask, how do we as a community as a whole need to act in order to do what is good and useful for us as a whole. So Aristotle says that's what a polis is. In other words, that's the essence of what a political community is. It's when a group of people makes decisions not on the basis of the interest of their persons or their groups that they're partisans of, particular interests they have, but where people accept to think on behalf of the good of the whole. That's when you really have politics. And that's more or less what Freud is saying here, that politics comes about when individuals renounce their own authority to make all the decisions. There's a lot of study of this in all kinds of philosophers. Aristotle, I mentioned. Also, two other famous ones are Hobbes and Locke from the 1600s, two of the figures who were most influential in shaping how we understand politics in our contemporary world. And Locke especially emphasizes that one of the things about entering into a political community is that you have to forego the gratification of revenge. You have to say, even though I really want to get even with that person for the bad thing they did to me, I can't do that. I have to call the cops and the courts and let the institution we've established decide how that thing is supposed to be dealt with, right? So coming together as a society means you as an individual have to give up the idea to just do whatever you want, whether that means just take the things you want that would be nice, and like maybe taking those apples that somebody else has, or seeing someone else as an object of pleasure and just seizing them for sexual gratification, or seeing somebody else as having done wrong to you and beating them up. In nature, that's what the Tyrannosaurus and the Triceratops can do, and the lion and the gazelles, to the extent that they have that kind of power. In civilization, we don't allow ourselves to do that, and we don't allow each other to do it, right? We, as a community, set limits on how those things are able to be done. And so, just to read that sentence again, right? The essence of this step is that the members of the community restrict themselves in their possibilities of gratification, whereas the individual knew no such limitation. That's the core idea. And now, just then to make the final point that he's really getting at here. Like technology, that move is a move that exists for the sake of making our lives better. Right? That is how we get out of that sort of state of nature and remove ourselves from all the horrible difficulties it makes for us, and allows us the possibility of a happier life with other people. That's the idea of it. But his point is that step, maybe it's essential, maybe we got to make it, but it doesn't just bring happiness. So at one level, it has to involve a little bit of a challenge, since we have to renounce our ability just to gratify ourselves however we want. As he also says at another spot, I think it's around page 73, he says, in many ways, what we think of as the development of the individual is kind of analogous to what, and he says, in many ways, what we're thinking of here as the development of civilization is basically analogous to what we think of as the healthy development of the individual. Part of growing up as an individual too is learning to live with others, like even just in your family or whatever. And so you do have to live not just as this kind of a desire-crazed, egocentric individual, which is a little bit how the newborn child is. The child has to learn to regulate and cultivate its desires and so on, so as to interact well with the people in its family. Well, a similar sort of thing is happening in society at a larger level. We're having to learn to take our own pleasures and satisfy ourselves in a way that fits in the larger, it fits in with the larger world of other people and the larger lives of other people. So the basic idea that we have to restrict ourselves is pretty much a healthy one, right? It's basically the idea that, like, that's at the foundations of ethical and moral life and so on. We have to learn not just to be mean, selfish individuals, but to satisfy ourselves and to try to make ourselves happy in a way that is consistent with justice, with good treatment of others, right? And so in that sense, the development of civilization is, sort of a piece with the development of the individual. It makes sense. But here's where the problem comes. So first of all, the simple fact that you have to restrict your pleasures is a challenge. It's you, in a way, turning against yourself and struggling with something in you for the sake of a kind of a higher good. So that's always the case. And, I see that with my 4-year-old son. Like, he's learning to do it, but he'd like to hit someone as soon as he's a little bit grumpy. He'd like to take whatever he sees, and et cetera, et cetera. But he's learning, he can't really do that, and he's growing through that. It's a good thing, but it's challenging. Well, in the same way, he says that's the struggle all of us face with civilization, is trying to figure out how to balance our needs for our own satisfaction and fulfillment with the restrictions that society will put on us, right? Now, as I just said, up to a point, that's healthy. Like, that's what civilization requires. That's what justice requires. So that there is society, and that society requires us to restrict ourselves for the sake of the good of the whole. That's a fine thing, right? But now here's where his real point comes. And this is from section 4. This is pages 79 to 80. This is where the real problem comes, and this is what we're getting at. So he says, thus civilization behaves towards sexuality like a nationality or social stratum that has subjected another one to exploitation. So basically what he's saying there is, sometimes you can imagine in the context of war or something, one country takes over another one, and then they use force to suppress whatever, the enemy or the rebels or whatever it is. Well, he says that's kind of what civilization is like towards sexuality. Our sexuality is this force, libido. It's this life force in us that is about our pleasure and our happiness and our self-expression and all that. And that's the thing, in a way, that society, to a significant degree, has to restrict and limit, in the way we were just saying. And then he says, to some extent, that in the way we were just saying, of course, to some extent that's justified. That's what civilization has to have. But the point he's going to make is that society goes way overboard in that. So he says, our Western European culture shows a high point in this type of development, where the development he's talking about is suppression. So he says it's a high point. That doesn't mean that's good. He means our Western culture has really hit the peak of going overboard in the suppression of sexuality. And he basically says, there's the immediately following sentences, he says, of course there's justification for this to some degree. The way that we were just saying, like, people have to limit their individual pursuit of pleasure for the sake of developing a relationship to others that handles them in a just and fair way and all the rest. But he says that our society has gone very far and has produced extremely unjust limitations on sexual life. And he says, in our society, for the sexually mature individual, choice of object is narrowed down to the opposite sex, right? We live in a society that enforces a heterosexual rule. And he says, and most extragenital gratifications are forbidden as perversions, right? You're supposed to only have genital intercourse with a member of the opposite sex. Of course, we know that people do all kinds of other things, and we live in a more liberal world with respect to those things than has been the case in some other decades. And yet it remains the case that we live in a world where in many places homosexuality is illegal. It remains the case that various kinds of sexual acts are illegal, right? And so he says, the demand expressed in these prohibitions for a single type of sexual life for all, that ignores the differences in the inborn and acquired sexual constitution of human beings. Right? There's something fundamentally dishonest about that as a relationship to people. And he says, and it cuts off a significant number of them from sexual pleasure, and thus becomes a source of grave injustice. So the justification for the limitation of the development of people's sexual lives in the first place is really simply justice. People have to restrict their individual pursuit of pleasure for the sake of, learning to respect justice, respect the good of all. And so that restriction of pleasure, of course, relates to sexual development and so on. But our society has gone way overboard in trying to enforce a model of what is an acceptable fulfillment of desire that really unfairly insists on heterosexual genital relationships as the only legitimate kind of sex. And other things, if they're not illegal, are either taboo or at least culturally frowned upon and so on. And he says, even there, he says, even so, and I mentioned this when we were talking about in the 3 essays, even so, there are people who can fit into that. Lots of people are going to fit into that heterosexual model, and it's going to work out okay. There's lots of people aren't, but for even if you look at those people for whom that's going to be okay, he says, the even heterosexual genital love, which is not banned, is further restricted by saying, you're going to have to marry somebody. You're only supposed to have sex with one person, and you're supposed to be married to that person. Right? So he says, today's culture makes it clear, this is on page 80, that it will permit sexual relationships only on the basis of an indissoluble connection between a man and a woman once and for all. In short, he says, our culture is based on this idea that it doesn't like sexuality as an independent source of pleasure. Right? That's in a way the sum. Right? The truth about our culture is that in deep ways throughout our culture, sex, like official and unofficial, sex is portrayed as something like a kind of necessary evil. So that's the big idea he wants to bring out here, that there is a deep force in our culture that is basically anti-sexual. And that is then having a huge impact on the people in this society. So he says a little bit further down in the next paragraph on 80, he says, indeed, the sexual life of civilized humans is severely damaged. So that's the last point I want to make here, and that's the real point from chapters 3 and 4 of this book, right? That civilization, we need it in various ways. If you think about what it would be like for us to face nature, it'd be impossible. But even in its instrumental relationship to nature, civilization is ambivalent. Technology is ambivalent, in some ways producing as many problems as it solves. But even more, civilization in the sense of law, in the sense of the regulations of our relations with others. On the one hand, that's the most important thing. That's what lets us live a good and just life with each other. That's what lets us live together. But the core principle of that, which is that the pursuit of pleasure by the individual has to be restricted and limited so as to facilitate the flourishing of the group. In our society, it has gone way overboard. And that need to restrict pleasure has become a kind of an overpowering force, really, such that contemporary society to a significant degree is actually anti-sexual. And that means, we were saying before, you have to grow up navigating your own personal psychological and physiological development with the interpersonal relations with the family. Yeah, that's one thing. But that also means that person growing up also has to learn to develop as a healthy and robust sexual individual in the context of a society that is actually working against that. So that's the point Freud wants to make here. And then next time when we go into the later chapters of the book, we're going to see more precisely how that works in society and how that kind of infects our personal psychology. And that will be then the last point he wants to make in the real core of his argument. Anyway, we'll leave it there and we'll come back to look at that next time.